Shadows of the Past. Mark Landon parked his car at the curb of the old neighborhood, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The faint rust of the orphanage's iron gate caught the early morning light, giving the building a strangely foreboding appearance. 14 years. It had been 14 years since he had left his infant daughter, Hope, in the care of St. Joseph's Home for Children. 14 years since he walked away, driven by desperation and fear. Now, the echoes of regret reverberated through his mind as he stared at the place that had once been his last resort. The imposing structure had undergone a transformation: fresh paint, a paved parking lot, and security cameras perched on every corner. But no amount of cosmetic changes could erase what Mark feared lay within. His daughter was here, or so he hoped. The thought filled him with both dread and determination. Was she thriving? Or had his decision to abandon her set her on a path of suffering? Mark stepped out of his car, the sound of his footsteps on the gravel amplified in the quiet of the morning. His expensive loafers felt out of place against the cracked pavement leading to the entrance. The building loomed over him, a silent reminder of his past failures. The receptionist greeted him with a polite but detached smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Mark hesitated, clearing his throat. "I'd like to inquire about fostering a teenager. I used to know someone who was here." The receptionist nodded, her fingers dancing over the keyboard. "We'll arrange for someone to assist you. Please wait here." As he sat on the worn-out bench in the reception area, Mark's eyes darted around, searching for signs of the life that inhabited this place. The walls were adorned with motivational posters and bright murals that seemed to overcompensate for the sterile, institutional atmosphere. Minutes passed before a woman in a navy blazer appeared. She extended her hand with a warm smile. "Mr. Landon. I'm Ms. Carter, the director. Let me show you around." Mark followed her down the halls, his heart racing with every step. The smell of disinfectant hung heavy in the air. They passed several common areas, where teenagers sat in groups, some chatting in hushed tones while others stared into the distance. "This way," Miss Carter said, gesturing toward a sunlit room. "This is where the older kids spend their free time." Mark's breath caught as his eyes fell on a girl sitting in the corner. She had long, golden-brown hair that framed a face so achingly familiar it felt like a punch to the gut. Her profile, sharp nose, high cheekbones, was unmistakable. "That's Hope," Miss Carter said, following his gaze. "She's been here her whole life." Mark's legs felt like lead as he took a hesitant step forward. "May I speak with her?" Miss Carter's expression flickered with hesitation. "Hope is reserved. She doesn't trust easily. But you're welcome to try." Mark approached cautiously, his palms sweaty. Hope sat hunched over a sketchpad, her pencil moving in quick, deliberate strokes. She didn't look up as he stopped a few feet away. "Hi," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her pencil froze mid-stroke, but she didn't lift her head. "Hi. I'm Mark," he continued, trying to steady his voice. "I'm here to learn about the children. What are you drawing?" Hope glanced up, her blue-gray eyes locking onto his. They were filled with something Mark couldn't quite place: curiosity, wariness, and a flicker of defiance. "A bird," she replied curtly. Mark nodded, unsure of how to bridge the chasm between them. "It's beautiful," he said, even though he hadn't seen it. "Do you like birds?" Hope's gaze returned to her sketchpad. "They can fly away. Go wherever they want." The weight of her words settled heavily on Mark's chest. He wanted to tell her he understood, that he had been trapped too, by his own fears, his own failings. But the words caught in his throat. "I'm sure you'll fly someday too," he said instead. Hope didn't respond. Mark stood there awkwardly, feeling like an intruder in her carefully constructed world. Ms. Carter reappeared moments later, a clipboard in hand. "I think that's enough for today," she said with a tight smile. "Hope, it's time for your group session." Hope stood, clutching her sketchpad like a shield. As she walked past Mark, he caught a glimpse of her drawing, a majestic bird with broken wings, surrounded by jagged bars. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Back in his car, Mark stared at the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The brief encounter had left him reeling. Hope wasn't the carefree, innocent child he had imagined in his mind. She was guarded, hardened in ways that broke his heart. He couldn't leave it like this. He wouldn't. Pulling out his phone, Mark dialed the number of a private investigator he had used in the past. "I need you to look into St. Joseph's Home for Children," he said, his voice firm. "Specifically, a girl named Hope. I want to know everything, her records, her treatment, everything." The investigator promised to get back to him within a week. Mark ended the call and leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Something about the orphanage felt off. The pristine exterior, the overly polite staff, and Hope's demeanor all painted a picture he couldn't ignore. He needed answers, about the life she had lived, the choices he had made, and the path forward. For the first time in years, Mark felt the weight of accountability pressing down on him. He had abandoned Hope once, but he wouldn't do it again. Not this time. As he drove away, the image of her sketch, of the bird trapped within bars, burned in his mind. Whatever it took, he would set her free. Shattered illusions. The week that followed was agonizing for Mark Landon. Every passing moment felt like an eternity as he waited for the investigator's call. Each day, his mind wrestled with guilt and doubt, replaying the fleeting encounter with Hope in endless loops. He could still see her eyes, filled with both defiance and weariness, staring through him as if she were reading the cracks in his soul. Mark buried himself in work, throwing himself into his company's latest acquisitions, but the distractions felt hollow. The opulence of his office, the applause of his team, even the numbers on his balance sheet, none of it held any weight against the chasm he felt inside. For the first time, success seemed like a cage rather than a victory. It was a Wednesday evening when the call finally came. "Mr. Landon," the investigator's voice crackled over the line, "I have something. You're going to want to sit down for this." Mark's heart sank. "Just tell me." The investigator hesitated. "St. Joseph's isn't what it seems. The facility is operated by a private organization that's come under scrutiny for alleged mistreatment and neglect. It's all under the radar, nothing that's made headlines, but the red flags are there." Mark gripped the edge of his desk. "What kind of mistreatment?" "Underfunded programs, overcrowding, and reports of psychological manipulation disguised as discipline. There's also speculation about financial mismanagement, the kind that would make certain staff turn a blind eye to questionable practices." "And Hope?" Mark's voice was barely above a whisper. "She's been there her entire life," the investigator replied. "Her records are sparse, but I managed to get a glimpse of some incident reports. She's been labeled troublesome. Multiple notes about defiance, isolation, and conflicts with staff. They've flagged her as unadoptable." Mark's chest tightened. "Unadoptable? Why?" "Hard to say. It could be her age. Most families want younger kids. Or it could be because she's seen too much and started pushing back. Kids like that don't fit neatly into the system's narrative." Mark slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing in the silence of his office. "This is my fault. I left her there." "Mr. Landon," the investigator said carefully, "what you do next matters more than what you did before." The next morning, Mark didn't go to the office. Instead, he stood in his walk-in closet, staring at the rows of tailored suits and polished shoes. None of them felt right for what he was about to do. Finally, he settled on a plain sweater and jeans. He needed to look human, not like the distant, unreachable man he had become. As he drove to St. Joseph's, his mind swirled with questions. How would Hope react if he told her the truth? Would she even want to see him again? Could he fix what he had broken, or was it too late? When he arrived, the receptionist greeted him with the same polite smile as before. "Welcome back, Mr. Landon. How can we assist you today?" "I'd like to speak with Hope again," he said, his tone firmer than before. "It's important." The receptionist's smile faltered. "I'm afraid that's not possible. Hope is unavailable for visits today." Mark narrowed his eyes. "Unavailable? She's a teenager, not a head of state." "I'll wait." The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "I'll inform the director. Please have a seat." Mark sat in the same worn chair as before, his leg bouncing with impatience. After what felt like an eternity, Miss Carter appeared, her expression as polished as ever. "Mr. Landon," she said, extending her hand. "I understand you'd like to speak with Hope, but unfortunately, she's occupied with her studies. Perhaps you could return another day?" Mark stood, towering over her. "I didn't drive here to be turned away. I have questions, about Hope and about this place. I won't leave until I get answers." Ms. Carter's smile tightened. "I assure you, everything we do here is in the best interests of the children. Hope is in good hands." Mark's jaw clenched. "Then you won't mind showing me her records? As someone interested in fostering her, I have a right to know." Ms. Carter's composure wavered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Our records are confidential, Mr. Landon. I'm afraid I can't share them without proper authorization." Mark leaned in, lowering his voice. "I have a legal team that would love to challenge that. But I'd rather not make this a public issue. So how about we skip the bureaucracy, and you tell me what's really going on here?" Ms. Carter's smile disappeared entirely. "Wait here," she said curtly before disappearing into her office. Mark didn't wait. As soon as she was out of sight, he slipped past the reception desk and into the hallway leading to the common areas. His heart pounded as he moved quickly, scanning the rooms for Hope. He found her in a small library, seated at a table with a book open in front of her. She wasn't reading, though. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her expression distant. "Hope," Mark said softly. She turned, startled. When she saw him, her face hardened. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said, stepping closer. "I wanted to make sure you're okay." Hope crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." Mark hesitated. How could he explain? How could he tell her that he had been the one to leave her here, that he had spent the last 14 years trying to forget the pain of that choice? "I care because you deserve better than this," he said finally. "I've seen what this place has done to you. It's not right." Hope's eyes flashed with anger. "What do you know about what's right? You think you can just show up and fix everything? You don't even know me." Mark took a deep breath. "You're right. I don't. But I want to. If you'll let me." Hope stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stood and walked toward the door. "Hope, wait," Mark called after her. She stopped, her back to him. "You don't belong here," she said quietly before walking away. Mark left the orphanage feeling more determined than ever. He had seen the cracks in Hope's armor, the pain she tried so hard to hide. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for her now. That night, he called the investigator again. "Dig deeper," he said. "Find out everything you can about St. Joseph's. And if there's even a hint of something illegal, I want it exposed." He hung up and poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, his daughter was trapped in a system that had failed her. But not for much longer. Mark didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He would do whatever it took to give Hope the life she deserved. This was only the beginning. The fractured mirror. The next morning, Mark Landon awoke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. The glowing screen showed a text message from the investigator, "Call me. It's urgent." Mark's pulse quickened. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, he grabbed the phone and dialed without hesitation. The investigator answered on the first ring. "Mr. Landon," the man said, his voice tinged with concern, "we've uncovered something troubling. St. Joseph's records show a pattern. Kids labeled as difficult or troublesome are routinely subjected to isolation tactics. Worse, some of the older kids, including Hope, are being used for unpaid labor under the guise of life skills training. It's exploitative at best." Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of labor?" "Cleaning, maintenance, and even helping with administrative tasks. These kids aren't being prepared for life, they're being treated like staff without the benefits. It's illegal, but cleverly disguised as part of their program." The words sent a chill through Mark. He stood, pacing the length of his bedroom. "And Hope? Is she safe?" The investigator hesitated. "There's no concrete evidence of abuse, but she's been reprimanded more than most. There are notes in her file about her defiance. She's refusing to cooperate with their so-called training. They've put her in isolation several times as punishment." Mark's jaw clenched. "What's their justification for this?" "They claim she's a disruptive influence. But from what I've seen, it's likely retaliation for her standing up to their methods. She's pushing back, and they're trying to break her spirit." Mark's voice was a low growl. "Not on my watch." That afternoon, Mark found himself back at St. Joseph's, this time armed with resolve and a plan. As he approached the front desk, he was intercepted by Ms. Carter, her polished demeanor as impenetrable as ever. "Mr. Landon," she said, her tone carrying a hint of exasperation, "I wasn't expecting you today." Mark didn't bother with pleasantries. "I want to see Hope. Now." Ms. Carter's smile thinned. "As I mentioned before, we have a structured schedule here. Hope is currently occupied with." Mark cut her off. "Save the excuses. I know about the unpaid labor, the isolation tactics, and the way you've labeled these kids. I'm not here to play games." For the first time, Ms. Carter's composure cracked. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped to a measured tone. "Mr. Landon, I don't appreciate baseless accusations. We operate within all legal guidelines." Mark stepped closer, his voice a quiet fury. "Then you won't mind if I file a formal complaint and have the state audit this place. You can explain your guidelines to them." Ms. Carter's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "There's no need for that. Let me see if Hope is available." Mark watched as she retreated down the hall, her step stiff with irritation. He could feel the eyes of the receptionist on him, but he didn't care. His focus was singular, Hope. 10 minutes later, Miss Carter returned with Hope in tow. The girl's expression was guarded, her arms crossed as she followed the director. When she spotted Mark, a flicker of recognition passed across her face, but it was quickly replaced by a look of wary indifference. "Mr. Landon," Miss Carter said with forced cheerfulness, "I'll leave you two to talk. Hope, you'll join the group session afterward." Hope didn't respond. She slid into the chair across from Mark and stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "You're back." Mark took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. "I told you, Hope. I care about you." Her laugh was bitter, cutting through the quiet room. "You don't even know me. You care about some idea of me. But I'm not your project." The word stung, but Mark didn't flinch. "You're right," he said evenly. "I don't know you. But I want to. And I want to help." Hope leaned back in her chair, her gaze unyielding. "Why? What do you get out of this?" Mark hesitated, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. "Because I should have been here from the beginning. I made a mistake, a terrible one, and I've regretted it every day since. Hope's expression shifted, confusion mingling with suspicion. What are you talking about? Mark leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. I left you here, Hope. 14 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. And I've been trying to live with it ever since. For a moment, the room was silent. Hope stared at him, her face pale. Then, slowly, she stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're lying. I'm not, Mark said, his voice breaking. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was scared, and I... Stop. Hope's voice was sharp, trembling with anger. You don't get to show up now and pretend you care. You left me. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, her hands clenched into fists. You think you can just walk back into my life and fix everything? You can't. I don't need you. Mark's heart shattered at her words, but he refused to back down. I know I can't undo the past, Hope. But I want to make it right. You don't have to forgive me, but I'm not going anywhere. Hope's breath hitched, and for a moment, Mark thought she might say something more. But instead, she turned and bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Ms. Carter reappeared almost immediately, her expression tight with disapproval. I think it's best if you leave now, Mr. Landon. Mark didn't argue. He knew he had pushed too hard, too fast. But as he walked back to his car, his resolve only deepened. Hope's anger was justified, but it was also a sign of how much she had endured, and how much she needed someone to fight for her. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had promised himself he would do whatever it took to help Hope, but the path forward seemed murky. How could he earn her trust when he had already failed her so completely? The investigator's voice echoed in his mind, what you do next matters more than what you did before. Mark picked up the phone and began dialing. First, he called a family lawyer to explore options for gaining custody or guardianship of Hope. Then, he contacted a journalist friend, someone he trusted to discreetly investigate the orphanage's practices. Finally, he opened his laptop and began drafting a letter to Hope. He poured his heart into it, explaining his decision to leave her, his regret, and his determination to make amends. When he was finished, he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He would find a way to get it to her, no matter what. As the hours stretched into the night, Mark felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. But for the first time, he also felt something else, hope. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future. And he would fight for Hope with everything he had. The fight for redemption. Mark Landon couldn't sleep. The confrontation with Hope replayed in his mind over and over. Her raw anger, her tear-filled eyes, her words like daggers, "You left me." They haunted him, driving him to question every decision he'd ever made. But Mark was not the man he had been 14 years ago. The younger Mark, the one who had felt the walls closing in when faced with raising an infant alone, had made a cowardly choice. This older version of himself, the successful, resourceful man he had become, was determined to right the wrongs of his past. Morning arrived, casting a pale light over his quiet home. The letter he'd written to Hope sat on the kitchen counter, sealed and ready. His plan for the day was simple: deliver the letter to her directly, and make it impossible for the orphanage to ignore his intentions. But as he prepared to leave, his phone buzzed. It was the investigator. "Mr. Landon," the voice on the line was steady but laced with urgency, "we've got something bigger. You need to hear this." Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm listening." I dug deeper into the staff at St. Joseph's. Turns out, one of their senior caregivers, Ms. Carter herself, was implicated in a neglect case at a previous facility. The case was quietly dismissed, likely due to lack of evidence, but the details are concerning. Multiple children in her care reported emotional and psychological abuse. And there's more. Financial records suggest irregularities, funds meant for programs and supplies aren't adding up. Mark felt a surge of anger. You're telling me the person running this place has a history of abuse and financial misconduct? Yes, and she's not alone. Other staff members have similar red flags. This isn't just a poorly managed orphanage, it's a place where vulnerable kids are treated like problems to be contained, not people to be helped. Mark paced his living room, his mind racing. What can we do? How do we stop this? There's enough here to file a formal complaint with Child Protective Services and push for a state investigation. But you need to decide how involved you want to be. If your name gets attached to this, it could become public. Are you ready for that? Mark didn't hesitate. I don't care about my reputation. I care about those kids, about Hope. Do whatever it takes to expose this. Later that day, Mark returned to St. Joseph's, the letter to Hope in hand. This time, he wasn't alone. The investigator had arranged for an independent social worker to accompany him, someone who could assess the situation from a professional standpoint. When Mark entered the orphanage, Ms. Carter's expression shifted from surprise to thinly veiled irritation. "Mr. Landon, I wasn't expecting you again so soon." "I'm sure you weren't," Mark replied, his voice calm but firm. "This is Ms. Reynolds, a social worker. She's here to evaluate the facility as part of my interest in fostering hope." Ms. Carter's eyes flicked to the social worker, her smile tightening. "Of course. We're always happy to have visitors. I'll arrange for a tour." As they walked through the halls, Ms. Reynolds asked pointed questions about staffing ratios, disciplinary practices, and how children's emotional well-being was addressed. Ms. Carter's answers were polished, but Mark noticed cracks in her facade, hesitations, overly rehearsed responses, and a growing tension in her voice. When they reached the common area, Mark spotted Hope sitting alone at a table, her sketchpad in front of her. Her shoulders were hunched, her pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes. "I'd like to speak with Hope," Mark said, turning to Ms. Carter. Ms. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. I'll let her know." As Ms. Carter approached Hope, Mark's stomach tightened. He watched as the woman leaned down, whispering something to the girl. Hope's body tensed, her grip on the pencil tightening. She glanced in Mark's direction, her expression unreadable, then stood and followed Ms. Carter toward him. Hope stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed. "What now?" she said, her voice flat. Mark took a deep breath. "I came to give you this." He held out the letter. Hope eyed it suspiciously. "What is it?" "It's everything I wanted to say but couldn't find the words for," Mark replied. "You don't have to read it now, but I hope you will." Hope hesitated, then snatched the envelope from his hand. She shoved it into the pocket of her sweatshirt without a word. "I'm sorry," Mark said softly. "For everything. And I promise, I'm not going to give up on you." Hope's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't get to make promises. Not to me." Before Mark could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall. Back in the car, Mark's hands trembled on the steering wheel. The encounter had been brief and painful, but he couldn't let it deter him. Hope's walls were high, but he was determined to scale them. The next few days were a whirlwind. The investigator filed the formal complaint, and the social worker submitted her report. Meanwhile, Mark began working with his legal team to explore the possibility of gaining custody of Hope. It was an uphill battle. He had no legal claim to her, and his past abandonment would be a major hurdle, but he refused to give up. One evening, as Mark was reviewing documents at home, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. Why now? After all this time? Mark's heart leapt. It had to be Hope. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he composed his reply. "Because I was a coward then, and I've spent every day since regretting it. I'm trying to be better, for you." There was a long pause before her reply came through. "I don't know if I can trust you." Mark's throat tightened. I don't expect you to trust me overnight. But I'll prove to you that I'm here to stay. Whatever it takes. There was no response, but Mark didn't mind. The fact that Hope had reached out at all felt like a small victory. The investigation into St. Joseph's gained momentum quickly. Within weeks, state officials arrived to conduct a thorough review of the facility. Reports of financial mismanagement and mistreatment of children surfaced, and staff members, including Ms. Carter, were placed under scrutiny. Mark received updates from the investigator and the social worker, but his primary focus remained on Hope. He continued to visit her whenever he could, each interaction chipping away at the barriers between them. One afternoon, during a supervised visit, Hope surprised him by speaking first. "Why did you name me Hope?" she asked, her tone cautious but curious. Mark smiled faintly. "Because you were my hope. Even when everything felt impossible, you gave me a reason to keep going." Hope studied him for a long moment. "You still think I'm your hope?" "Yes," Mark said without hesitation. "You always will be." For the first time, Hope's expression softened, if only for a moment. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And for Mark, that was enough to keep fighting. The walls began to crumble. The investigation into St. Joseph's was escalating quickly. State officials had suspended several staff members, including Ms. Carter, and the orphanage's operations were under intense scrutiny. The atmosphere inside the facility had shifted, children were wary, whispering in hallways, and the remaining staff treaded carefully under the watchful eyes of auditors and social workers. For Mark Landon, the changes felt like the first real steps toward justice. But his focus remained on Hope. She was the reason he had embarked on this journey, and despite the progress being made on the institutional front, their personal relationship was still fragile. Mark had continued sending letters to Hope, each one carefully crafted to address her anger, her pain, and his own shortcomings. He didn't expect her to respond, but he hoped that, in time, she might start to believe in his sincerity. One chilly afternoon, Mark arrived at the orphanage for another supervised visit. This time, he carried something special, a carefully wrapped gift that he hoped would spark a connection. The social worker overseeing the visit, Ms. Reynolds, had approved it, though she warned Mark not to expect too much. Hope entered the visiting room wearing her usual guarded expression. She sat down across from him, her arms crossed, her body language shouting, "Don't get comfortable." "I brought something for you," Mark said, sliding the gift across the table. Hope eyed it suspiciously. "What is it?" "Open it and see." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the wrapping paper. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she tore it open. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook, its cover embossed with her initials, along with a set of high-quality drawing pencils. Hope's expression flickered, a mixture of surprise and something softer that she quickly masked. "Why?" "I noticed your sketchpad was almost full," Mark said. "I thought you might like a new one." She ran her fingers over the cover, tracing the initials. "You think you can buy me off with gifts?" "No," Mark replied evenly. "I just wanted to give you something that's yours. Something you can use to express yourself." Hope didn't respond, but she didn't push the sketchbook away either. Instead, she picked up one of the pencils, rolling it between her fingers. For a brief moment, Mark thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile. The following week, Mark received an unexpected call from Ms. Reynolds. "Mr. Landon," she said, her tone cautious but optimistic, "I thought you should know, Hope has been using the sketchbook you gave her. She's been drawing during group sessions, and the staff says it seems to help her focus." Mark's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and hope. "That's good to hear. Thank you for telling me." "There's more," Ms. Reynolds continued. "She's asked if you're coming back for another visit. It's the first time she's shown any interest in seeing you." Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. "When can I come?" At their next visit, Hope was waiting for him when he arrived. She had the sketchbook tucked under her arm, and her usual guarded expression seemed less pronounced. "I'm here," Mark said as he sat down across from her. "I'm glad you wanted to see me." Hope shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity, maybe, or the beginning of trust. She opened the sketchbook and slid it across the table. "Look," she said. Mark leaned forward, his breath catching as he took in the drawing. It was a bird, a magnificent, intricate creature with its wings spread wide. But this time, there were no broken bars around it, no signs of confinement. The bird was in flight, soaring against a backdrop of open sky. "It's beautiful," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got real talent, Hope." She watched him closely, as if gauging his sincerity. "I didn't think you'd care about something like this." "I care about anything that matters to you," he said simply. Hope's gaze dropped to the table, and for a moment, they sat in silence. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave me?" The question hung in the air like a weight, and Mark felt his chest tighten. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, the words felt inadequate. "I was scared," he admitted. "Your mom had just passed, and I didn't think I could be a good father. I thought you deserved better than what I could give you." "You thought leaving me here was better?" Hope's voice cracked, her eyes filling with tears. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" "No," Mark said, his own voice trembling. "I don't. And I can never take back what I did. But I'm here now, and I'm going to do everything I can to make it right." Hope stared at him, her expression a storm of emotions, anger, hurt, and something softer that she seemed afraid to show. Finally, she looked away, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said. "You don't have to," Mark replied. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'll keep showing up, no matter what." As the investigation into St. Joseph's continued, changes began to take shape. The state intervened, placing the children under temporary protective custody while they reviewed the facility's practices. Hope and the other teenagers were relocated to a new group home with better conditions and more attentive staff. Mark visited her regularly, their relationship slowly shifting from guarded interactions to cautious conversations. Hope began to open up about her life at St. Joseph's, the isolation, the punishments, and the loneliness that had shaped her. One afternoon, during a visit, Hope handed Mark a folded piece of paper. "Here," she said, her tone almost casual. "I drew this for you." Mark unfolded the paper to find another bird, but this one was perched on a branch, its wings tucked close. The expression in its eyes was cautious but curious, as if it were deciding whether to trust the world around it. Mark looked up, his throat tight. "Thank you, Hope. This means more to me than you know." Hope shrugged, but there was a faint smile on her lips. "It's just a drawing." "No," Mark said. "It's more than that." In that moment, he felt the smallest crack in the walls that had kept them apart. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to keep going. Hope was finding her voice, and Mark was determined to make sure she never lost it again. The fight for redemption wasn't over, but for the first time, Mark believed they might actually win. The road to healing. Months had passed since Mark Landon's first visit to St. Joseph's. The transformation in both Hope and himself was undeniable. While their relationship was still tenuous, it had begun to grow roots, fragile yet persistent. Mark had fought relentlessly, not just for Hope, but for the other children trapped in the same cycle of neglect and abuse. And while the system didn't change overnight, progress was being made. Hope had been placed in a transitional foster home while the state worked to find her a permanent situation. Mark, however, had made it clear that he wanted to be her guardian. The legal process was slow and complicated, and his history of abandonment worked against him, but his determination was unwavering. One sunny afternoon, Mark arrived at the foster home for a scheduled visit. Hope met him at the door, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She looked different, her posture more confident, her eyes less clouded by suspicion. "You're early," she said, her tone somewhere between teasing and accusatory. "Guilty," Mark replied with a grin. "I didn't want to waste a second." Hope rolled her eyes but gestured for him to follow her inside. The foster home was a cozy, welcoming place, filled with the sound of laughter from younger children. Hope led him to a small patio in the backyard, where they often sat during their visits. "I finished something," she said, opening her sketchbook and flipping through the pages. Mark leaned in, watching as she carefully turned the pages. Her drawings had evolved, still filled with the same intensity, but now there was a sense of hope in them. Finally, she stopped on a page and handed the book to him. The drawing was of a tree, its branches bare except for a single bird perched near the top. The bird's wings were open, ready to take flight. Surrounding the tree were faint outlines of other birds, as if they were just beginning to emerge. Mark stared at the drawing, his chest tightening. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "What does it mean?" Hope hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. "It's me, I guess. The bird on the branch. I used to think I was stuck, like I'd never leave the tree. But now, I don't know. Maybe I can." "You can," Mark said, his voice firm. "You can go anywhere, do anything. You're stronger than you think." Hope's lips quirked into a small, reluctant smile. "We'll see." As their visits continued, Hope began to ask questions, not just about the past, but about the future. She wanted to know about Mark's life, his work, and the choices he had made since leaving her at the orphanage. At first, the questions were guarded, as though she were testing him. But over time, they became more open, more genuine. One evening, during a rare dinner out together, Hope asked the question Mark had been both dreading and hoping for. "Why do you want me now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "After all this time?" Mark set down his fork and looked her in the eye. "Because I've learned what matters. I thought success would fill the emptiness I felt, but it didn't. I've spent years running from my mistakes, but running doesn't fix anything. I want to be here for you, Hope. Not because I'm trying to make myself feel better, but because you deserve to have someone who shows up for you." Hope studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, a small but significant gesture. The turning point came one crisp autumn morning. Mark received a call from his lawyer, informing him that the court had approved his petition to become Hope's legal guardian. The news left him breathless with relief. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was the culmination of months of effort, of proving to Hope and to himself that he was ready to take responsibility. He picked Hope up that afternoon, the paperwork in hand. When he showed it to her, she stared at it for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "So, you're my guardian now?" she asked. "Yes," Mark said, his voice filled with emotion. "If that's what you want." Hope looked at him, her expression softening. "You're stubborn, you know that." Mark chuckled. "I've been told." She folded the papers carefully and set them aside. "I'm still mad at you," she said, though her tone lacked the sharpness it once held. "I know," Mark replied. "And I'll keep working to earn your trust." Hope glanced at him, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "You're off to a decent start." Life together wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, of unspoken resentment bubbling to the surface. Hope tested Mark constantly, as if waiting for him to prove her worst fears right. But Mark didn't waver. He showed up for her school events, celebrated her small victories, and gave her space when she needed it. Slowly, Hope began to let her guard down. She started leaving her sketches on the kitchen counter for Mark to see, and they began sharing meals together without the awkward silences that had once filled the air. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a documentary about wildlife, Hope turned to Mark suddenly. "Do you think people can change?" she asked. Mark thought for a moment before answering. I think people can grow. It's not about forgetting the past, it's about learning from it and trying to do better. Hope nodded, her gaze thoughtful. I think I might want to try. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. You're already doing it, Hope. Every day. Months turned into a year. The bond between them deepened, forged through shared experiences and hard conversations. Hope began to thrive, not just academically, but emotionally. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter, channeling her passion for drawing into creating portraits of the animals to help them get adopted. One day, as Mark was cleaning out a closet, he found the first sketchbook he had given Hope. Tucked between its pages was a folded piece of paper. Curious, he opened it and found a note written in Hope's small, neat handwriting. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. But I think I want to try. Maybe that's enough for now. Mark smiled, his eyes stinging with tears. It was enough. More than enough. On the anniversary of the day Mark had first walked back into Hope's life, they visited a local park together. As they strolled through the trees, Hope pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw. Mark sat beside her, watching as her pencil brought the world to life. What are you drawing this time? He asked. Hope glanced at him, a real smile lighting up her face. Us, she said simply. Mark's chest swelled with emotion. He reached out, gently ruffling her hair. You're incredible, you know that. Hope rolled her eyes, but she didn't pull away. You're not so bad yourself. For an old man. They both laughed, the sound carrying through the crisp autumn air. In that moment, the past didn't matter. What mattered was the present, and the future they were building together. Mark didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but one thing was certain, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. Hope had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, a chance to be the man he wanted to be. A father.